for making the trip tonight and attending our second Free Market Foundation Award ceremony. My name is Martin van Staden. I'm a member of the Executive Committee and the Board of the Foundation. Now, after the Second World War, it seemed that there was very little that could stand in the way of the March of Freedom. The world saw what seemingly benign populism, telling people what they want here and giving them exactly what they ask for, could develop into. Now the West, after the Second World War, recommitted itself to freedom to an extent of fighting an entire Cold War about it. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, and particularly in Africa, things started looking up. Economic growth, constitutionalism, and these things were at the order of the day, and I think South Africa was really one of the biggest beneficiaries of this trend. But although the seeds of this disease were already planted in the 1970s, from around the beginning of the 2000s, the West's confidence in its premier value of freedom came under quite stringent attack. It started as an academic attack, but has since developed into quite a multifaceted movement, popularly known as social justice. Now, in the name of equality, liberty has been demoted to a second order, or even a third order consideration. And if that wasn't bad enough, in 2020, large parts of the world as we knew it came to a complete end. And of course, freedom was the primary victim. Now, the FMF has decided to establish an award last year because it was clear to us that the advocates and innovators who drive change in favor of freedom rather than against it, which is in vogue now, were not receiving the recognition they so richly deserved. But there are many awards out there, and even one or two in South Africa say they are in favor of freedom. But none of them really end up recognizing the activists and the thinkers on the ground, and the Free Market Foundation Award is different. The foundation bestowed the first award on pandemics data and analysis, or PANDA, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. You either love them or you absolutely despise them. And the reason we gave it to them was not for any view on medicine or vaccines, but for their demystification of lockdowns, all in the name of human freedom, and I think they continue with that today. And it is again, of course, on the topic of human freedom that we turn to our second FMF Award recipient. Sihle Ngobezi, also known as Big Daddy Liberty, is a revolutionary appearance within South Africa's fledgling liberal ecosystem. In his student days, he openly, and from what he tells me quite confrontationally, spoke the language of freedom on campus, where the ideas of liberty are not at all as popular as one would imagine they would be amongst young people, amongst the rebels of our society. And he did this while studying towards becoming an industrial sociologist, now holding an honors degree in industrial, organizational, and labor studies. Sihle then had a stint in government service. Nobody's perfect, but now he finds himself doing what is clearly his passion project. With his Big Daddy Liberty brand and its associated multimedia shows and content, Sihle wants to make liberty practical and real to ordinary South Africans in a down-to-earth way, non-academic and non-theoretical. Sihle filters current events through his keen eye for relevant deprivations of and threats to freedom, and alongside his occasional guests, concretizes these for general consumption. Sihle actually did a brief show this afternoon here in the FMF office, sitting down with a lawyer to explain the implications of a constitutional court judgment handed down today. The FMF's Rule of Law project was an amicus curiae in that case, and it is good to announce, in fact, that it was our arguments that won the day. It was a severe strike against the government's BEE racial interventions in our economy. Now, it was quite a technical legal case, but Big Daddy Liberty's viewers, who are also joining us tonight, are now understand what it means a little bit better than the general public. Now, I am honored that I have been a guest on Sihle's shows many times before, especially during this last year. And it's refreshing for a change for me to be introducing him rather than the other way around. The outpouring of support from his followers when he leads a conversation about freedom, property rights, and the rule of law really is something to be behold, because it is not something that you see anywhere else online in South Africa. But over and above these insightful conversations, really Sigle is on the ground talking to ordinary people about these ideas and how they link with the difficulties that they experience day by day. Now, one thing sets Sigle apart from the history of liberal commentary and advocacy in South Africa, and that is that he is not nice. We liberals tend to have a destructive obsession with courtesy and formality. While our entire philosophy is premised on the limitation of state power, we often go out of our way to appear reverent towards the state, our leaders. Disgusting, of course, and I will never make sense of why we as liberals do that. And in South Africa's context, it is especially bewildering that we do that. But Sigle's straight talk really is a refreshing appearance amongst the usual liberal crowd. He is part of a new breed of liberals. And the Free Market Foundation, for its part, is doing what it can to facilitate this new generation of advocates for freedom. Some people have expressed concern and ambivalence about that. But please allow me to clearly state it up front again so that there is no missing the point. The gloves are coming off. Of course, the FMF is not the only organization to have consciously made this decision. The Institute of Race Relations, AfriForum, Solidarity, the Ellen Suzman Foundation, all these organizations, especially since the pandemic began, have realized that South Africa is failing, and it is failing quickly at this stage. Playing nice with politicians is simply no longer a viable option. Of course, if politicians want to be part of the solution, we will eagerly welcome them, but we will not wait for them. Sigle is part of this process. He believes in the battle of ideas, but he does not only look at the word ideas in that phrase. He also sees the word battle. It is a fight. And we do not have to play nice. We certainly do not have to mince our words. And I am glad to welcome Sigle onto the stage to accept the Free Market Foundation Award, because he certainly does not mince his. Sigle, please allow me to extend you.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well deserved.
Thank you.
Well deserved.
Thanks.
Great.
Awesome.
You do have some water here?
Great. Well, must admit I'm not very initiated in winning awards and the like. Most of my work is out and about and not in these sort of spaces, but I'll speak to that tonight. And maybe before I do, Martin did mention that there is an audience outside of you guys here, and I just forgot to do one thing, so if you can just give me 2 seconds, sorry. Sure. I'll be a little rude, as I just make sure that the feed is not interrupted. At this point, elevator jingle music will play to buy me time. But there we go. We do not need the elevator jingle music. I'm back. Folks, once again, thank you very much for this award. Thank you very much for this opportunity to perhaps share with those who are uninitiated as to what it is I really do, right? Most people just know me as Big Daddy Liberty, the host of the Big Daddy Liberty show. I appear on your screens, whether it's your mobile phone, or I've seen people watch me on big screens. So very intimidating, but my name is Sihle Ngobese. I think you all know that. However, I'm best known as Big Daddy Liberty. I'm the host of the Big Daddy Liberty show. It's an online platform, an online show. It's pretty much classically liberal for the American audience out there. We're conservative with a small c. And what it really is a show that's designed to speak to South Africans about how we create a sort of South Africa we want to see, one that's defined by the very thing that South Africans have never enjoyed, and that's freedom. If you go through our various points of history, whether it is our colonial era, apartheid, or even today's ANC government, democracy, freedom has never really been high on their list. It's always been one form of statism, that is state control of a society that migrates to the next, and always through the lens of a racialized society, whether it's a English colonial or Afrikaner nationalist, or even today's African nationalist, black nationalism, which plays itself out not only in our various spheres of government, society, but of course also in the laws that govern us. So my tone is going to be a little bit more modulated now because I'm going to go to my speech. But all of these principles that I speak to and how we defeat them in this battle of ideas, and how we inject the sort of ideas that inspire a country to seek out liberty, to make freedom their most important and singular most important political value, that's what I'm going to, hopefully by the end of the speech, inspire in you and ignite a flame in you, actually, to be a part of. So that being said, the show, the Big Daddy Liberty Show, it was launched in 2018. I am the host, as I said, of the BDL show. We're a classically liberal or really libertarian, or Americans, I always have to sort of pander to them a little bit, conservative with a small c type online show and podcast. The mission of the show and my advocacy work, of course, is to spread and popularize the idea that you have the right to make decisions about your life, your family, your business, free from any unnecessary government, political, or bureaucratic intervention. So that tonight, this morning, what I'd like to share with you is, in a few moments, is a vision of a South Africa that matters to me. I want to paint a picture of how liberty can transform our home, South Africa, and in the process inspire you to join me in that ground war that you'll probably hear me talk a lot about tonight, of persuading fellow South Africans to stand up for their freedoms and to understand that you are very much a part of that battle of ideas, and of course the fight for asserting our individual rights. The individual in South Africa, whether you're black or white, really has always been under assault. And it is time for ordinary people like you and me to actually firmly draw the line in the sand and say, in terms of defending our rights or the encroachment of the state, here and no further. Your very life, liberty, and property is being eroded by the growing tide of populism, socialism, and of course predatory politicians. Their goal is to strip you of your freedom, your income, your property, and even your very savings. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, that sounds a little bit dramatic, Big Daddy. Is that a hyperbole? Well, the simple answer is no, it isn't. And allow me to demonstrate why I argue it isn't hyperbole to say this by using three broad headings. Namely, as I turn the page, I feel very Jacob Zuma-esque right now. Those three headings, namely being life, liberty, and property. And I'll show you under those three headings how your rights actually are being eroded. And I'll conclude, of course, by sharing how I've approached this battle of ideas and how I've taken, more importantly, how I've taken the fight to the streets and on the ground. So the methods. You have to first understand your opponent. A lot of people don't, and because they don't, they tend to underestimate the cunning nature. And I use that word purposefully because Martin and I spoke about the cunning nature of our opponents. These are people that you need to understand who reject the idea of South Africa being a home for all people, where we're free, independent, and of course self-sufficient. They hate the idea of that. In fact, they want a South Africa that's divided, and where white South Africans, for example, are accused of being land thieves, oppressors, and are seen as the source of all of South Africa's problems. That is a convenient scapegoat. Equally, on the other hand, they want to paint all black South Africans as being weak, victims, incapable of free thought, and of course, nefariously in need of their control. That's the goal. To achieve these goals, as I sweat like a pastor fighting off a SARS audit, to achieve these goals, they've resorted to identity politics, and we've seen this quite recently in this country. It's identity politics and, of course, groupthink, where nobody is an individual, or rather, nobody is an individual to be judged by their merit. Instead, they argue, each of you are determined by a group or an identity, such as your race, your gender, your ethnicity, your income level, or any other social identity they determine. That's the key in their world. Of course, In this sense, collective guilt and collective judgment is often ascribed on individuals, even despite whatever your individual beliefs and behaviors may be. This outlook, of course, is fueled by an axis of academics, social justice warriors, or these social justice activists that we often hear, who are increasingly corrupting mostly university spaces, and most concerningly, because those universities produce graduates, those same graduates then enter the world of work and society with those terrible postmodernist ideas of critical race theory and, of course, intersectionality. Now, I mention these ideas because they literally are what dominate the quote-unquote mainstream, especially in the Western world and definitely in most English-speaking parts of the world, in which I include South Africa, and ever increasingly in other societies around the world. These ideas that are a rebranded, a reinvented version of classical Marxism are pervasive in our social spaces and, of course, in governments around the world, and, of course, in the mainstream media. Or as I like to call it, the corporate media, because I argue what used to be called alternative media, is actually quite mainstream now. The ideas, and these ideas, of course, as I mentioned, are born out of classical Marxism. However, there's been a slight modification, with them having recognized the failure of classical Marxism over the 20th century. Of course, you just need to look at the 100 million body count of corpses that classical Marxism has created. Upon realizing how bloody the socialist and communist experiments of this ideology were, the academics and the elites began to abandon it as inadequate, began to abandon it as they began to abandon it as a means of effectively analyzing society, where historically Marxism used class to make the point that a society has a oppressor class, if you will, and a victim class, what Marx called the proletariat, i.e. the victim class, the working class, and the bourgeoisie. These ideas are born... so they modified it, of course, sorry. Having moved away from classical Marxism and the class analysis, recognizing the inadequacy of it today, they modified these ideas. So instead of class struggle and describing group divisions in society as being those of different classes, that is, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, many of these postmodernist ideas transitioned to reimagining such groups as being rather based on identity, not class, but identity. So race, gender, and any other attribute of that nature, to which social theories then developed to support this shift in approach. The new focus still relied on making the classical Marxist argument of there being a relationship of exploitation and oppression of one over the other, only this time the primary focus wasn't on the bourgeoisie oppressing the working class, but rather on those group identities argued to hold power and privilege, oppressing and exploiting those that don't. See how that little shift of sleight of hand occurred. So, for example, and rather predictably, theories that they developed, such as critical race theory, identifies this relationship in a racial sense. And of course, the theory of intersectionality creates a broader framework for these lefties, providing for the supposed influence of one identity trait, such as gender, income levels, etc., and arguing that actually they intersect in some way in the way of influencing how one group oppresses the other. So these race, gender, and identity-obsessed ideas have real-world consequences. They don't just reside in the academic and the university space. Their very nature, they're primarily polarizing, and they focus on segmenting people into groups, with one characterized, of course, as being problematic/oppressive, juxtaposed against other groups that are pathologized as being weak or victims, a victim class. In South Africa, these identitarian, which is how I refer to them broadly, these identitarian ideas have worked to try and divide the country, where, for example, white South Africans, or specifically whiteness, because they're very crafty and cunning in language. They're very aware of the fact that, with a country like ours that comes from a racial and racist past, they're very clever not to pick on white people directly. And so they ascribe a a proxy expression. So whiteness, they'll say. I mean, you hear Malema say this all the time. He'll say something like, oh no, I don't hate whites, he'll say. I don't hate white people, I just hate whiteness. Which of course, gobbledygook, and really it's classic Marxist doublespeak. Pardon me. So it's these traits, therefore, that they'll argue, such as whiteness, which we're told is an identity trait of oppression. On the other hand, identitarians will casually paint black South Africans as weak victims, as somehow incapable, and as mentioned earlier, in need of their woke identitarian control. Adherents of this way of thinking are trapped in identity politics and groupthink, where nobody is an individual to be judged on their merit. Instead, as I pointed out, they'd argue that each of you are determined by your group identity, such as your race, your gender, ethnicity, income level, and any other social identity. These are the dangerous and polarizing ideas Sorry, I'm trapped by my own sentence construction here. Let me take two steps back. These are the very dangerous and polarizing ideas that in real terms are actually quite easy to rebuke. They're easy to disprove in debate and of course in the free exchange of ideas. However, this is the problem. Ever increasingly, it has been the methods used by identitarians to actively prevent debate and to prevent or stymie the voicing of opposing views that has caught the attention of advocates of liberty like me and many others, because it's the methods that matter and not necessarily who they are. Now, with you generally understanding who it is that you're faced up against, with you generally understanding what it is that they stand for broadly, and why they abhor and reject classically liberal and really liberal values of free speech, really a free society. Now that you understand your opponent and what methods they use to paint and malign you as the enemy, let me talk about the actual bad ideas that they use to erode your life, your liberty, and your property rights. That's a new 3-part heading there. Keep up with me, folks. I hope you do. How do they erode life, liberty, and property? On life. Our country is at the mercy of a political elite and identitarians who believe in the bad ideas of identity politics and socialism. Socialism, of course, is the ideology that drives parties like Julius Malema's EFF, Andile Nxitama's BLF, and of course, your favorite, in some cases, Cyril Ramaphosa and his ANC. Yes, Cyril Ramaphosa is a socialist. Because I know the comment section on my show right now is going, what? But he's a businessman. No, he's not. He's a kleptocratic beneficiary of state largesse, red in tooth and claw, commie socialist. Take it to the bank. Anyway, socialism is neither a fair nor a progressive political philosophy. It calls, of course, for the collectivizing or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production, how we produce things in society, often centralizing that power into a small collective. These are people who believe in growing the size of government, expanding its reach, and of course, its ability to interfere in all aspects of our lives. We've seen this play out, of course, in, as more taxes, more red tape regulation, and more ways to extract income and wealth from ordinary people like you and me, people who actually on an everyday basis are likely struggling to make ends meet. They don't care though. The overall impact of this approach, the overall impact of the socialist means through which our politicians approach governance and policy has been that the ordinary South African, or rather South Africa, let me begin with the economy, has never really shown potential to grow at a requisite level to create the sort of jobs, the sort of middle income country that we aspire to be. In fact, that overall impact has been that despite its extraordinary potential, this year the South African economy will continue to grow much slower than any other emerging market, with a forecast growth rate of a paltry 1.9% being forecast for 2022. Last year, inflation was just under 4.4%. Now, this might not seem like a big number, right, or 4.4%, that's okay, Big Daddy. But consider this. If you maintain that 4.4% year on year, it would effectively mean that any long-term savings you have after every 10-year interval would lose about 44% effectively of its value, roughly. It's a rough calculation here. I'm hearing famed economist David Root saying more, which exactly is underpinning my point, which is I'm being conservative in this estimation. You're likely to lose much more than 44% over 10 years. Now, South Africa's debt to GDP rate has more than doubled in less than a decade. The budget deficit is plumbing apartheid-era lows. More than half of young people, indeed 60% plus, do not have a job. And for all the talk of politicians, especially the famed Cyril Ramaphosa, of this famed fourth industrial revolution and smart cities, the IRR has actually estimated that only 3 out of every 100 children will pass matric, or pardon me, pass maths in matric with a grade of 60% or higher. Good luck with that fourth industrial revolution. You cannot enjoy a standard of living. Leave the economy aside. You simply cannot enjoy a high standard of living if those living in that society are not safe, as is the case in South Africa. Close to 500,000 people have been murdered in this country since 1994, at a rate per capita that is almost 30 times that of Australia. And because I'm in the farming world now, it's important for me to just quickly mention this. When it comes to farmers, that rate is about 52% higher than the average in the country. The number of violent protests has increased by at least 300% in a decade. Popular confidence in the future of the country has fallen by more than half in the decade to today. And of course, when you look at our opposition parties, who really don't shine themselves in glory, despite a heavy appetite for change from voters, and we all saw this in the last election, despite that heavy appetite from voters for change, opposition parties continue to stumble over themselves and opposition parties continue to stumble over themselves, and we're seeing that in the squabbling and the jostling as they sort of try and position themselves in the various coalition governments at a local government level around the country. That's opposition parties. The ruling party itself, despite the Zondo Commission optics, remains in the ruling party itself, despite what you saw in the Zondo Commission and the sort of dog and pony show that was. The party in it remains many of the ideologues and many of the perpetrators of state capture that did so much harm to our prospects in the decades since the policy conference of the ANC in 2007. So for all the talk of, oh, we'll deal with those who perpetrate state capture, it's all an illusion, as I often say on the show, hashtag don't be dribbled. That same 2007 ANC conference that I mentioned, where Jacob Zuma was voted in as ANC president, also saw the ANC move sharply to the left and double down on its destructive strategy of the National Democratic Revolution, which is, of course, the policy framing which the ANC operates under. Now, if you thought that the subsequent voting in of Cyril Ramaphosa at the ANC conference was a new dawn, you'd be wrong. As the ANC, continues to pursue the socialist policy of the National Democratic Revolution, testament to this has been how, under the Ramaphosa presidency, the most destructive and divisive policy of expropriation without compensation has been the center of its policy framework, and in the process has done sufficient harm to investor confidence and has tipped the country into a recession. Because most people forget that prior to, the spicy cough in 2020, and I'm calling it that because I'm on YouTube, I can't use its actual term, else I'll be demonetized. But the spicy cough, having begun in 2020 and its consequent lockdowns, people tend to conveniently forget that we were already in recession prior to that. So we walked in literally as a crippled nation, economically speaking. So that this new dawn brings with it more bad ideas from the ANC to rival those of a red in tooth and claw communist EFF. The ANC manifesto, if I bring your mind back, much like the EFF, was a roadmap to greater power for politicians and more predatory policies. Now, so long as these politicians and their cronies and their crony connections, so long as they live a good quality life and enjoy the trappings of, a state of South Africa, trust you me, nothing will change for the rest of us. They do not mind eroding your income and your standard of living so long as they are okay. Rules for them and not for us, or rather the other way around. At just over 10.4%, South Africa has one of the 10 highest personal income tax to GDP burdens in the world. Yet, as economist Mike Schisler points out, the personal income taxes collected are not even enough to pay the government's wage bill alone. Government wages are well over 40% higher than the total number of personal income taxes collected. With the belief by politicians that government and the state are the optimal means of organizing society, we have seen the growth in the size of government and, of course, at the expense of the income growth and potential prosperity of hard-working South African families. The bloated size of government, the high taxes, are effectively an assault on your quality of life and, of course, your freedom. According to that same economist, Mike Schisler, shout out to him, by the way, and prayers for Mike. I won't say why, but just pray for a homie. According to Mike Schisler, South Africa had the 10th highest personal income tax burden in the world. I read that, my bad. This has only gotten worse, of course, in the sense that the ANC government has introduced more taxes, higher taxes. For instance, in this Ramaphosa period, we saw an increase, for example, of the value-added tax. So even poor people, who are often argued, oh, they don't bear the brunt of taxes, they'll say, actually do, and disproportionately larger. The cumulative effect of these poor policy decisions and bad ideas is that South Africans are effectively getting poorer. According to the NIDS CRAM serve data, both acronyms, 1 in 5 South African households experienced hunger in the last quarter of 2020. 20% of this country experienced hunger. The ANC know that you're overly taxed and that your income is under strain. But they don't care, because it's a revenue stream for them. And instead of providing relief, they're changing tactics. That is, instead of providing tax relief, they're changing tactics. And they're now coming after your property, your assets, and even your savings and your pension. Thus, on property. I said life, liberty, and property. On property, therefore, there is a dangerous and a nefarious attempt by politicians to start employing policy approaches which give them power to confiscate property from you and your family. Your very freedom to own property in this country, to be able to say that this little piece of land, my small piece of Africa, your ability to even say that is under threat by a political elite who see you, as they say, wanting a future where you own nothing and you're happy. Of course, it's under threat by politicians via policy, right? All things whittle down effectively to policy. And in this regard, land expropriation without compensation, for as much as the constitutional amendment attempt, that is to amend the Constitution to do this, was defeated, the actual land expropriation bill is still very much a threat. Since 2008, an organization that I work very close with, the IRR, had tracked about 30 separate pieces of legislation, policy, and regulatory attempts to undermine property rights. Trust you me, the commies are very busy in this country. Do not sleep, for they don't. It's important to understand that property as defined in our Constitution is not limited to land. It includes the car you came here in, the very cell phone in your hand right now, and even the cash in your wallet or even your bank account. You need to understand, of course, the full context of what predatory politicians are after when they tout policies like EWC, or expropriation without competition, without compensation, pardon me. It's your land, your assets, and your savings. The expropriation bill, as I mentioned, of 2019 was tabled just a year after Cyril Ramaphosa came into power. I'm trying to dismantle this idea that there's somehow a good ANC represented by a Cyril and a bad ANC represented by the RET faction. It's the same trash. In fact, that very expropriation bill was drafted by some of Cyril's closest cadres in that party. The bill gives wide powers to politicians to be able to take property and not have to compensate the person dispossessed. Dr. Anthony Jeffrey, perhaps one of the most leading expert voices on this topic, wrote the following about the bill. Open quotes, "The bill empowers many organs of the state, including municipalities, to expropriate land or any other property by following a set of specified procedures. These are heavily skewed against the owner and, of course, heavily in favor of the government," close quote. If that sentence alone doesn't... Anyway, this is not the sort of power we should be handing over to the state and to politicians. It has little to do with addressing land reform, as it does nothing to build a culture of secure landowners with property rights, even if that land is a beneficiary, or landowner, pardon me, is a beneficiary of a land restitution claim. Ask any South African, as I do in my travels around the country, under the banner of the show, especially RDP beneficiaries, those people who got free state homes, free in inverted commas, ask them if they have a title deed to own that home. And the answer you'll get is very surprising, given the rhetoric from politicians about the people shall own. Ultimately, if the state is given the power to dispossess you of your land and property, you must understand that that power comes with the threat of state guns and violence. Let me play out a very realistic scenario for you here, based on my own experience. As I said, I'm an aspiring commercial farmer. I've recently taken over a family plot that's been in our family for multiple generations. My family has an estimated cumulative 50 hectares of land in rural Emapumulo. This is near Stanger. We, the Ngobese family, have called that piece of land home for as many generations back as I can trace through oral history. Ironically, despite this, despite the fact that we have at least 4 or 5 generations on that land, I can't produce a title deed today for that land because it's owned by the state via my king and the Ingonyama Trust. It is this lack of property rights which makes it easy, of course, for a local traditional leader, or more specifically, really, government officials with the backing of that same government to dispossess me. That government official can really, if he wanted to, appear at my farm gate with a few police officers, in other words, men with guns, and essentially tell me how I can or can't use it, or even demand that I vacate that piece of land. Now, what do you suppose happens if me, being who I am, rocking up in my veldskoene and my shorts and, you know, often topless, because that's how I work on the farm. Yes, picture that. You know, imagine me rocking up at the gate with a 12 gauge and saying they should fob off, right? What do you think likely happens? Well, he'll likely return to the farm gate with an even bigger force of police officers. In other words, more men with more guns. That's the sort of violence you face in this country if you try and stamp and defend what should be property rights and not privileges. Now, this scenario might sound extreme, right? It might sound like some yeehaw type American type scenario, but really it's aimed at having you understand what's at stake when politicians in the state are drunk on power. In fact, it was George Washington, the first president of the US, who had actually aptly said, open quote, that government is not reason, it's not eloquence, it's force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Never for a moment should it be left to irresponsible action, close quote. Politicians are ever increasingly desperate to deny us this right to our property, and as mentioned earlier, property isn't limited to land. Our very ability to own our wealth is under additional threat in this country. The ANC, in its election manifesto under Cyril Ramaphosa, have proposed to introduce the policy of prescribed assets. Now, this policy would give politicians the power to compel pension funds and other asset managers to invest in certain companies, such as those that belong to the government, you know, Eskom, Sanral, Petrosa, etc. I'm sure you can gauge from that list of companies as to how profitable they are and where your investment would go if it went there. This is, of course, expropriation without compensation under another name, and it's aimed specifically at your savings. After all, being forced to invest in a poorly performing government-prescribed asset will mean that the pensions of South Africans will be worth less when they retire. Often that's the part of the story we're not told, as they sort of dribble and distract and say, oh, you see, it's only the rich who are complaining. Nonsense. Most pensioners in this country are people, hardworking, everyday South Africans, and they hope against hope that when they do retire, there is something in there that will see them to their end of life, often from retirement, which is around 60 to 65, and of course till people are getting older. Most people are living beyond 80, 85. So 20 years of your existence where you're hoping your savings will see you through. So that, ladies and gentlemen, I get to a point where I hope the picture is getting clearer. Bad ideas by those who are in political power and their cronies have real-world effects on the quality of your life and your living standards and, of course, on your property rights. The overall assault, therefore, that is the overall assault, is actually on your civil liberties, your very liberties, the freedoms that see you be you. No, I'm not going to say cheers like the politicians do in Parliament. Remember I said I'd frame the problem through 3 headings: life, liberty, and property. You've heard the life part, you've heard the property part. Let's talk about your very liberties, therefore, before we get to how we fight back. South Africans are being told, ever increasingly, and the lockdown period and the spicy cough in particular have been very instrumental in showing us this, have been told that is to put up with less freedoms and rights. In fact, the main argument you hear today in the corporate media and from the political elites is that somehow advocating for your freedoms is selfish. Adherents of identity politics and the politicians they prop up are attacking the very personal freedoms and civil liberty that you and I enjoy. Our freedom to speak freely, to articulate ideas, whether they're controversial or not, is under attack by people who ever increasingly act and see themselves as the thought and language police. Our ability to earn an income freely, save it and invest it in the way in which we see fit is ever increasingly being limited by greedy politicians who are taxing us to death and yet wasting or looting that very same money. Our inherent right, for example, because I'm going down the freedoms, the liberties that are under attack, our inherent right to self-defense, in my view, a God-given right to self-defense, by extension, what I consider should be the right to bear arms, because it's considered a privilege in South Africa, that very right is under threat in this country. A certain asshat minister of police is literally, oh, I'm sorry, most people are not initiated in that term. That's literally what I call him on the BDL show. A certain minister of that description seeks to pass ever-restrictive gun control laws, including a proposed amendment bill that would remove self-defense as a reason for applying for a gun license. Such anti-liberty measures only put red tape in the way of law-abiding citizens who are trying to defend themselves, yet will do nothing, as is the case right now, to stop the very violent and very murderous criminals in this country from accessing guns themselves. Quick story. When it was the July riots in this country, parts of Gauteng here and KZN obviously descended into complete anarchy. There's one story you probably picked up in the news around a certain police container that had hundreds of thousands of rounds in it, some firearms and the like, that just simply went missing from what should have been a secure facility of the South African Police Service. Let me assure you, it hasn't gone missing. Those of us who live in the townships around Durban, especially my township of Mlazi, hear that ammunition go off every single evening. There is such a wanton and free firing of guns, likely illegal guns, by criminals, that it begs the question, how is it possible they can afford ammunition that we in the gun community are saying, hey man, this is getting expensive? There are places in certain townships, I won't name them now because they'll be in a special documentary that I'll be shooting on crime, where you can even buy hand grenades and explosives, mostly of course for the loyal customers who do cash in transit and the like. So guys, let me assure you when I say this, criminals are not deterred by gun prevention laws or gun restriction laws. They will still get the guns. It's only you and I who are meant to be the sort of scary force, the scary reaction let me rephrase that. It's you and I who are meant to have the same firepower that scares criminals, who will be the ones who are stripped of that ability to defend ourselves. As I move on, the very freedoms that are under assault in this country include a freedom to make choices around your own body and your healthcare and where you access healthcare. For example, will be severely hampered if the state introduces what is effectively the nationalization of healthcare in this country by way of the National Health Insurance, the NHI. The NHI, very simply, I won't go into too much detail here, it's basically creating an ESCOM of healthcare, where the state controls healthcare, decides who gets what, and of course there's always shortages. So that with you understanding what I mean by liberty, what I mean by your freedoms that are being eroded by bad policy, bad ideas, and a nefarious group of individuals who are driven by toxic ideas, the question then becomes, how do you draw the line, how do you fight back? And that's the part which I think I've inserted myself, I've placed my, how does one frame this, my very existence, my body, my everything, in defending the rights and the freedoms of South Africans of all walks. I've given up a plush middle-class existence, sold most of my assets in order to fund some of this, and thankfully received assistance from certain organizations, i.e. the Institute of Race Relations, no need to be cryptic, in order to live this Big Daddy Liberty lifestyle and show. What is it? What is the Big Daddy Liberty lifestyle? What is the BDL show? On the one hand, it's the show, right? I broadcast twice, maybe 3 times a week. The BDL show, Liberty and Friends, and various vlogs. That's the fun part. That's the part most people see and they think, oh, this is clearly what he does. Yeah, that's about 40% of what I do. 60% of what I do involves literally at times getting and living in my bakkie, traveling this country, going to communities across this country to have these sort of conversations that I'm having here in the spaces where the conversations often don't happen, in the very places where we don't think people can understand Murray Rothbard or Frederick Hayek or John Stuart Mills. And of course they wouldn't in that sense, in that highfalutin sense, but they definitely understand the principles, the ideas, and the how does one even put it, the ideas. They definitely understand those ideas when they're framed in everyday lived experience. And that's what I do. That's the 60% of what I do. And let me assure you, this is the process where I always argue it's not a one-man show. It's not a Sihle or a Big Daddy Liberty show. It's an all of South Africa approach. Part of what I'm doing and why I do it is to incentivize those South Africans who often feel alienated from the process, if I can steal a little bit of Marxist rhetoric there, who feel alienated, who feel as if, all of those things happen there, far from me, in Pretoria. I live in Jan Kempdorp or Enyanga or Kakamas. Those things don't reach me. They affect me, but they don't reach me. My mission is to show people that actually they do reach you, they do affect you, and it's you and the power of you, the individual, that has the ability to push back against this. I talk a lot about the individual. Really, we're a family society. So insofar as I mention individuals, I'm talking about the South African family. So what can you do to join the battle of ideas? And how do we begin to fight back against the socialism that seeks to destroy this country and, of course, its families? As mentioned, I'm already in this fight. The Big Daddy Liberty show, since its inception 4 years ago, has garnered about 7.6 million views on my videos over Facebook and YouTube. In addition, I've traveled the length and the breadth of this country, speaking to citizens on the ground and pushing liberty ideas through either on-street interviews, where I'll put an issue to people and engage them in real time, and of course bring it to you on the show so that other people see that, oh, hang on, that person had a certain idea. Maybe they were an avowed communist, and in a little 5-minute interaction, started agreeing with my positions. It's important for people to see that process of changing people and winning them on the ideas. So I do on-street interviews and various engagements. This part often doesn't make it on the show, often because most people, like Nicodemus in the Christian Bible, come to Jesus in the night. Various community organizations, often linked to the ANC or the EFF, or even their branches, will contact me on my show and say, hey, come and address us Obviously, we don't want the cameras, but we want to hear certain ideas that we're watching on your show. The biggest one, which is arguably one of the more popular ones, or the top three, was when I did a special feature on taxis, and it was called Taxiland. It is on my channel, where I advocated that actually it's very possible to reform the taxi industry because it is a great example of the free market. To reform it and bring the rule of law into it, and then make that the standard for all other sectors and industries in the country. Massive, massive fan base amongst the taxi community in this country. Massive fan base, it's sometimes scary. Yeah, sometimes really scary, including taxi stopping going, are you a big daddy? You're a big daddy liberty. Anyway, moving on. And they really do, like they watch every single episode in some cases. They can quote stuff. Anyway, but yeah, as I said, it's either these on-street interviews, as I mentioned, or of course, various organizations that invite me. Stockfells are big fans of me. When I speak about, income growth and household savings, the Stockfell community in this country really has been receptive to that. Especially as I also talk about cryptocurrency. And like, how do we protect our money from the state? I'm like, that's a good question, mama. But let me be frank here, people. As hulle sê in Afrikaans, ek's net 'n gewone man. And to that effect, I'm just one guy. The battle is about you and getting you involved, out of our little comfort zones or our little protective safe spaces where we don't want to engage those evil people. You've got to come out and actually talk to your fellow South African. Because I keep saying this, I said this before we started seeing, a sweeping change politically. And people called me mad 3-4 years ago when I said this. And I said, this country will change in the next 5 years. But what it really needs is ordinary, everyday individuals to reach your fellow man, inject the liberty ideas, and give them a purpose to show up. Whether they show up at the ballot box, or they show up at a protest, or they show up at a parent-teacher meeting, wherever they have to challenge state power, give them a purpose and give them the ideas to rally around. Don't give them a personality. Don't be another Malema or another Cyril or whatever the case may be, because that comes and goes. The ideas last forever, and this is what I seek to do. Whether it's from the Limpopo to the Cape, the Karoo to Khayelitsha, I'm taking the message of liberty and the power of property rights and the market economy into every community. I want to arm those citizens with good ideas that will help them in their area to push back and fight back against the bad ideas of politicians and, of course, the leftist socialism. This is your moment to draw the line in the sand and to say here and no further. Pardon me. If we unite behind these ideas, and as I said, not political personalities, we actually can roll back the tide of bad ideas and, of course, predatory politicians. For fear of repeating myself, I want to move on to the how. And how do you take these ideas of liberty, how do you take these ideas of property rights, how do you take these ideas of free markets into communities and actually connect with people? Because you're not going to do it if you're going to say things like, oh, I'm here because a guy named Thomas Sowell or Frederick Hayek or whatever the case may be. You're not going to reach people that way. And understand this, your political opponents know that too. They don't walk into communities and talk about Marx or Leninism or any of that nonsense. They walk in and talk about bread and butter issues, everyday issues, but they translate their ideas through that lens. I do exactly the same thing. And this is where, much like a boxer, I go toe-to-toe with them. So how is the everyday question that I get? Well, let me demonstrate these in another 3 examples. I'm coming in threes here, people. Let me demonstrate them as I conclude in 3 areas. How you can translate liberty ideas, property rights, and free markets into everyday lexicon. I'll use safety, healthcare, and of course education as my examples. If I walk into a community meeting that I asked for from an influential community organizer, I know I'm going to focus on these 3 areas because these 3 areas transcend race, income level. I don't care if you are a Fortune 500 CEO driving in an expensive German sedan, at a traffic light right next to that chap who pulls that trolley and puts recyclables in it. Both of those individuals at different economic levels, but if you talk to them about their safety, about their healthcare and that of their families, and of course about the education of their kids, they will understand exactly what you're talking about. So on safety, to keep families safe, whether in townships, suburbs, or rural communities, these are some of the ideas that I inject into communities and have feedback on. You know, I might do something like propose, of course, gun ownership in this country to become much easier for those law-abiding citizens, good, sober, sane and moral people to have the ability to defend themselves. Now let me put it into practical terms, just to show you how this isn't just a shoot 'em up cowboys idea and that it resonates with a lot of people. There's a group of ladies who work, maybe I shouldn't mention them all, just in case they are singled out. In Cape Town, very popular mall in that part of the world. And there's a group of ladies from Khayelitsha, one of whom is a big fan of my show, and said, hey BDL, come through to site B Khayelitsha, informal settlement. Sorry, can't really guarantee your safety, but you know, there's a group of about 15 to 20 of my colleagues who we work at this mall, and we often do the night shift, or we come home late rather, there's no night shift, they come home late. And we want you to talk to us about this notion of safety and what we can do, and of course, gun ownership. I rock up to this meeting, and of course, they finish quite late. So it was there around sort of 8 in the evening in this case. So they came home a little earlier than usual because they only finish work at 9. And because of public transport, they only arrive home at around 11. So imagine arriving to one of the most dangerous parts of Cape Town, getting off a bus at a bus stop and perhaps walking another kilometer through an informal settlement to get to your shack. Imagine the terror of having to do that every single evening. I don't think most of us can. And me having arrived at that same area at a sort of evening basis and having to leave the car on the main road, you have a palpable sense of how much danger and how dangerous this can be. So in this meeting, I was very frank in that conversation. I said, look, you're not going to fix this overnight, but one of the things you can do at an individual level is each of you ladies with training, proficiency, and training, and training, and training, because I have to re-emphasize that bit, you can become a responsible gun owner so that you at least have the option in the moment where you come under attack to be able to stand your ground and actually defend your life, your liberty, and your property rights in that moment. And you now have a group of 15 ladies who had never really had this conversation before, flock to certain gun shops in Cape Town and literally apply for gun license proficiency. And thank God I have friends like Gideon Hubert, of paratus.info who can attest to that, insofar as saying they've seen a change in demographic at their workplaces in people applying for proficiency in gun ownership and, of course, the training. So it's responsible gun ownership. It's not a shoot-'em cowboy scenario. But in addition to this, you know, how do people secure the home? I call for incentives. For example, you know, we all know the state has failed us in terms of providing safety and security. I don't need to rehash that part. So what can we do to safeguard our homes, our families? I call, for example, ideas such as if you spend money on putting burglar bars or safety beams or whatever the case may be, or putting a fence around your shack and burglar bars in your shack, you should get a tax exemption for that kind of expenditure. You should have money back in your pocket so that you can spend money on things that matter to you and not have that money go to some politician or official in Pretoria who couldn't give a flying fudge about your safety. Communities should be allowed, for example, to elect their own station commanders at the time of, just for example, local government elections, or at the very least a CPF, a community policing forum, having greatly expanded powers to appoint station commanders. Trust you me, this idea I put to people on my show. If you go back quite a bit in my catalog to an ANC rally, where I went to the ANC's election manifesto launch in Durban, and I spoke to ANC members and I proposed these very same ideas, resounding positivity from people saying, you know what, I actually don't even know who the station commander is. This would be a great way of me getting some form of control over the guy who runs the affairs of our local police station. He must be more accountable to the community. And of course, as I said, community organization is much more important to me than relying on the state. So developing highly organized, well-resourced neighborhood watch schemes that are integrated primarily with private security, and of course once SAPS gets its act in order with the police, is a surefire way of having communities safeguard their own homes and their own families. Nothing happens without actual community participation and really the individual getting involved. So these are some of the ideas that I push, and none of it saw me speak about Mills or Sowell or any of that. It's ideas that inspire people to say, I want this, how do I advocate for it? How do I put pressure on my local politician? I'm giggling because there's a case where they chased a certain local councillor demanding some of these ideas, and he was voted out, thankfully. On health, I reject the idea of the ANC's national health insurance and really the nationalization of health in this country, which would only impose a heavier tax without fixing the actual problems. So some of the ideas I push out are effectively, I can whittle it down to this, just because I want to conclude. How about we take the power and the resources out of the hands of politicians and the state and put it into the hands of families and really individuals? So on the health front, I'm a major advocate, of having the state spend its health budget by breaking it up into vouchers and giving it primarily to poor individuals or all individuals. The details you can work out, that's for you to figure out minutiae. But you could actually give people vouchers, and we've run some of the numbers, depending on how you delineate, whether you give it to certain individuals under a certain income bracket or to all individuals. You could give people approximately 14 to 16,000 rand per person for them to then decide where they shop and buy for medical aid for themselves. And you trust me when I say this, if you suddenly had millions and millions of poor South Africans have a voucher, a health voucher, of between 14 or 16 or whatever the figure may be, trust me, the market will respond to that. They will provide medical insurance schemes that cater to sucking up as many of those vouchers as they possibly can, thereby seeing millions of South Africans be freed from a substandard public healthcare system and suddenly be able to access and even incentivize the creation of more private options of better quality to compete for those vouchers. I can do the same thing on education. Just to conclude, again, introducing school choice and education vouchers, where you break up the Department of Education's Department of Education's budget into vouchers for parents. Again, whether you argue poor parents or all parents, again, you're seeing around 20 to 22,000 rand per learner is currently being spent at the moment by the state. But the question is, are we seeing outcomes that reflect 22,000 rand of spending per child? The answer is no. So how about you remove who spends that money and give it to the parent? Have the parent decide which option is best for their kid with that same 20,000 rand. And again, I must say this, that's the demand side, of course, of education. The supply side will quickly catch up to match that. There already are private options in education in this country that are doing exactly this. Curo, for example, recently launched a school in, Delft in Cape Town, a rural township where there's parity. They will tell you, we spend roughly 20 grand per learner here, which is about the same as the state, but we provide better outcomes. Parents are clamoring to trying to get their kids into those schools, including poor parents. This is the one thing about individuals and really parents and families that amazes me. A parent will do anything and everything for the benefit of their family. They will beg, scrimp, and save of what they don't have so that their kids get a better opportunity. Even though we know realistically that kid is more likely to do better than their parents as an aggregate, they will still invest everything they have for the benefit of those children. And why shouldn't policy support that, is the argument I'm making. And if we can infuse the sort of liberty ideas that encourage those people to get behind ideas and to fight for them, by God, that is my mission. You'll forgive me because I've become a bit emotional when it comes to this point. Because I was raised by a single parent who was physically handicapped. So I know what it is, and I know what it means for a parent to do anything and everything for the benefit of a kid. And I'm arguing to you, and I'm making the point to everybody in here, that you need to carry the exact same passion in advocating for these ideas for every South African, because every kid deserves a shot at a better South Africa. every family deserves to live in a safe, prosperous, free, and non-racial South Africa. And that's what we stand for, and that's what I stand for as Big Daddy Liberty. So that as I conclude, what does 2022 look like for me? What am I looking to do for fellow South Africans? What will BDL look like in 2022? Well, now that we stand, now that Big Daddy Liberty is an entity on its own, I'm no longer yoked to the IRR. I'm heading out and looking for support from other organizations, from other individuals, and saying actually 3 things need to happen from the show this year as we fight for liberty. Number 1, we'll continue broadcasting the show. It's what I like to call the air war, if I can use some military terminology here. Just imagine me in green beret and a big fat cigar. The air war, that's the easy part. That's producing a show 3 times a week, you know, the BDL show, Liberty and Friends, and various vlogs. The Big Daddy Liberty show itself, I'm looking to build a small studio or rent a small studio to which to broadcast out of, and much like Carte Blanche, I come to you once a week and I have correspondents around the country who produce liberty-orientated stories from where they are. So I'm looking to eventually, once we get the funds, be able to hire, for example, student journalists who have an interest in libertarian, liberty-orientated, classically liberal, or even conservative values, producing short 3-minute inserts, 3 to 5-minute inserts on special issues in their areas, where we can then bring those to you on the BDL show through the lens of liberty, competing with the corporate media in this country in providing that sort of content. That's the vision for this year. That's what I'm fundraising for and looking for support to be able to do. So that's the vision for 2022. As we up the game when it comes to the air war and transmitting liberty and ideas. The second element of it, of course, of those 3 things, I told you I'm coming in 3s today, is the ground war. I'm looking to launch what will be called the Mazakele campaign. Mazakele is a Zulu word for build it yourself. And it's often what is, especially in townships in KZN, there's certain sections of our townships where people literally did that. They built their own homes, and they're not RDP homes. And there's a certain ethos that developed. It's a very much a liberty ethos that developed from that. Because once people had property rights, they realized, heck, I can actually save up, build on this household, in other words, use the household as a way of saving, and build wealth. And you can see it discernibly, a big difference between areas and townships which are, or Mazakele, versus areas that are built by the state. Most cases, state homes fall apart within a year of them being built, or the area in which they're in are slightly more deteriorated, slightly more downtrodden, versus those areas where people have built their own homes, and there's that ethos of looking after something because you own that. So I want to take that ethos around the country and showcase those South Africans who have literally built things for themselves as a means of inspiring others to demand the exact same freedom. I want to do things for myself. As I always say to people when they say as a final thought, you know, so what are you, Sihle? Are you a classical liberal? Are you a libertarian? Are you a conservative? And I say, look, you can apply all 3 of those taglines, but really, I'm guided more by a set of instincts than an ideology. The first instinct, of course, is that I believe that the individual should do more, should do more, and that the state should do less. The second instinct is that the state should, the individual, should, sorry, let me rephrase. The individual, firstly, should do more, and that the state should do less. That secondly, the individual should own more, and that the state should do less. And of course, the individual should aspire to more, so that the government can aspire to less. It is those 3 instincts that guide me and the approach to which I use in communities across the country. So with that being said, and with me wrapping it up there, let me thank you all for listening, and thank the Free Market Foundation once again for this Free Market Foundation Award. Thank you.
Your questions.
Yeah, sure.
Great. So thank you, Sihle. That was a very impassioned talk, and you richly deserve the second Free Market Foundation Award, and we look forward to seeing what you do next. So we'll keenly follow that progress. So we do have some time for questions. Eric.
Comment on the Canadian truckers.
Ooh. Very dangerous. Very, very dangerous.
Oh, they're the worst thing ever. They're the worst thing ever. I can tell you this. It has been a long time coming. What you're seeing those Canadian truckers do in Canada, and do it literally aiming that wrath, if you will, towards the state. You saw it happen in this country, albeit in a much more disorganized way, I'll grant you that, in those July riots. People are frustrated by a small elite, often a political elite, literally lauding their comfort, lauding effectively what has been the biggest transfer of wealth over this lockdown period from poor people to the elites, the rich. There is a frustration at that you're seeing bubble over by people who the left would have historically called the working class or the poor. It is those people who are now expressing themselves and actually saying, no, freedom is a God-given right. It is a natural right, if you will. And we refuse to see political elites continue to go down this track of arguing that we need to stymie our freedoms so that they can effectively get more control over the society. So to answer your question directly, I'm in full support of the Canadian truckers. And I even said this in a tweet, being a little tongue-in-cheek as a final point. You know, the lockdown period, the state of disaster, and the spicy cough madness in this country would have ended much sooner if you had seen a coalition of taxi drivers, truck drivers, and our farmers in this country get together and say, we're rumbling our tractors, our combines, our taxis, and trucks, and we're going to the union buildings. Before they even put the key in and turned it, Ramaphosa would have appeared on TV and said, my dear South Africans, it's all over.
Question, why hasn't that happened here?
Because unfortunately, people are very compliant. It takes a great deal of personal pain for someone to actually realize, you know what, enough is enough, number one. And also, when they start to look around to see if it's a shared sentiment, it often takes that one individual who's loud enough, who's brave enough to say, yes, you're not alone. This is a shared sentiment for you to then lead something. South Africa, unfortunately, doesn't have that. We have a very compliant society here. And again, I say that with a pinch of salt, because it's mostly the middle class and really the elites are very compliant with what the state demands of them. And it's often the poor who see the nonsense first and are loud about it, but we then sort of dismiss as being a violent rabble on the fringes, on the outskirts. It's a very elitist way in which we view poor people. But poor individuals in South Africa are often the canary in the gold mine. They're the first to tell you when actually the state is infringing on a basic freedom that you simply don't feel yet because you can afford to avoid the state by way of your income, right? Because that's what most middle-class South Africans really are. We pay to avoid the state. So you don't have to go to a government clinic. You don't have to go really to a police station unless you've had something stolen and you just need a reference number for insurance. Again, insurance. You know, there's many things that we do to insulate ourselves from feeling the effects of the state. And it's often poor people who are the canary in the gold mine. So I would argue this period of craziness and I can say lockdown. It's a spicy cough word, I can't say it. This period of lockdown has actually shown South Africans across the income strata that the state is not your friend, and really it's something to be fought back against. And please, all power to that. And how do we know this? Look at the last local government elections. Those statists who have been doing this to you know, they can see the writing on the wall when it comes to 2024. In fact, in the province in which I live in as a final gasp, in the province that I live in KZN, you've got to remind yourself, the ANC got 41% of the vote overall in the province. In Durban, they fell under their highs of 60% in the last election, and they got 44% of the vote. That tells you everything you need to know about the state of ordinary South Africans and how they have a short tolerance for the kind of politicians who have been very smug and comfortable in lauding their power up till now.
When we vote, we decide who gets employed. Directly, if it's a local government councillor, ward councillor, indirectly with proportional representation system, through what I like to call the labour brokers. Okay, and it is our decision who gets employed. Plus, we pay our taxes, whether it's corporate tax, whether it's income tax, whether it's VAT. We are should be described as the employers of the politicians. And that is the message which you're going to take the streets, I would hope, to say that the politicians are actually there, that they should be there to do your bidding. And we need to put a policy in position to change that around. And the description I've got with that is direct democracy, where the people will make the decisions that the politicians cannot touch. Your comment, please.
Yeah, it's a very popular stream of consciousness that developed, especially around the sort of lockdown period. You know, a lot of prominent people started coming out advocating for this hashtag direct elections, which is absolutely correct, right? You do want, first of all, I always argue that state power should be as local and as decentralized as possible. You don't want a big state. I don't want a big state. And to the best of that ability, I would argue, and this is where I get a little radical, you know, national government should be slashed by about 70%. We shouldn't really have a massive provincial government either, nor should we have a all-powerful local government, but at the very least, if you are going to have the most influential levels of government, it should be at a local level. But even then, temper their powers to as much as possible. What you really want, ideally, is a society where individuals and really families are the ones who enjoy the power and the resources in a, what is, I often say this, right, a free, prosperous, property-owning and non-racial society. That's the vision, that's the goal, which we're building, especially here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. And I often argue that it's not a hard sell at all. People get it. When you approach them by what we have as shared values, and this is the part where I often get in trouble with fellow classical liberals, but I often say, it's the values that allows me, it's the foot in the door when I'm talking to communities. And those values, broadly speaking, if you look at who South Africans are, I often say, across the spectrum of color, race, income, creed, South Africans by and large are three things: God-fearing, law-abiding, and family-orientated. So if you want them to give you their ear, so to speak, express those values through how you express express the ideas through the very values that are in common with them. So you often see me on my show advocate for faith, flag, family, and freedom as a motto, a tagline, because I recognize that's often how I put my foot in the door in most cases. But once you're there, the ideas matter more than those values.
Any other questions, comments?
Maybe something. One of the big maxims is you vote your way into socialism, you shoot your way out. And I can't remember the author of it. But how soon do you see our Canadian trucking moment, or the French Revolution one, on lever tout l'été?
Look, I think we've had numerous cases of it, right? Again, it comes back to what I said earlier on. Poorer South Africans have been warning us about the nature of the state. The problem is we just spoke a different language in inverted commas, right? Most individuals in our townships, in our rural areas, in our informal settlements, when they see the state is up to shit, excuse my language, when they see the state is up to nonsense, they'll take to the streets and destroy everything, but effectively express that anger. Unfortunately, it alienates most of us in the well-to-do class, because we look at that and almost we turn our noses to it and go, oh, how dare they do that? But we don't actually take the time to listen to what they're saying is going wrong. So we've had moments. I mean, I've cited the data. We've seen a 300% increase in the number of violent protests in this country in the last 10 years, effectively. And why? Because people can see the decline, and it's often the poorest who see it first, both in terms of those three areas of life, liberty, and property. So simply put, I would put it to you, maybe to answer the question directly, if we can see that this is what is happening in Canada and other parts of the world, perhaps we South Africans need to reevaluate what we value more. Do we value a South Africa which we can actually hand over to our children, that is prosperous, free, property-earning, and non-racial? And if we do value that, what kind of work do we need to put in now, getting us out of our comfort zones? So for instance, I sold everything I have. I mean, I had a nice flat and a plush job, and everything is very hunky-dory. And I too was that guy who was scrolling through news channels and seeing protests around the country and going, you know, look at that. How dare they destroy public property and blah, 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 blah. That snobbishness ended very quickly when I realized, hang on, those are fellow South Africans. There's a reason they're doing that. It isn't just because Skop and Donor is Skopskiet and Donor is how we do things. No, there's a reason for that. And it's once you listen to the canary, you then realize, heck, I have two things that I can do as a South African. And I can do both, by the way. One, look after myself, look after my family, provide for them. Absolutely. That's the first imperative of any individual. Number two, once that's pashash, once that's right, I then reach out to the fellow South African and I say, how do I improve your ability to do exactly as I do? How do I inject you, so to speak, with the ideas that allow us to rally and around that idea push back against the people who have no incentive for us to be free, self-sufficient, and independent?
Yes, sir.
Last question,
Yes, sir.
last comment on your side. We have seen that in South Africa, the politicians have really tried to make sure that they are not interested in the unity of South Africans. And that's why you find black and white never talk. And if they talk, it's negativity, never building on each other, never trying to say, how do we take things forward? And under such, you've also highlighted the fact that the cabal have always just been looking after themselves and they don't give a damn with the rest of us. And the question that I have, in line with also what you said, it always takes people hating to get themselves to do something. What will spark that hate?
That's a very good question, because the answer to it you might not like. Because the answer to it might see me enter a very dark or open a very dark conversation around the state of things and how bad they can actually get before most people wake up and realize, heck, we're in a very bad place. Thankfully, most South Africans are beginning to wake up, as, sorry, we say in Zulu. And I think what it's taken, ironically, is the lockdown period and the spicy cough. I think the lockdown period saw politicians say the quiet part out loud, which is we have every intention of reducing your freedoms, every intention of destroying your income, every intention of destroying even foundational values as South Africans, that very much faith, flag, family, and freedom thing that I spoke of earlier on. Let me be precise and specific. If you remember back to the beginning of the lockdown, what did they do? They shut down places of worship and even employed jackboot police to come break up people. And, I have to remember that video of the mosque where the police came in and said, don't talk to me about your Allah. And they dragged people out of that mosque. What do you think that did to the psyche of a very faith-based South African society? 97% Christian, strong Muslim communities, very tight, unite Jewish communities, where I find most of my faith and my prayer. What do you think that did to us? What do you think it did to South Africans when they saw images on TV of police breaking up church services here in Gauteng? I just forget where, I think it was on the Vaal, if I'm not mistaken, where pastors were beaten up by police, congregants were shot at by rubber bullets. What do you think that did to the psyche? Bayavuka abantu. People are waking up and they're realizing that the politicians used this lockdown period to say the quiet parts out aloud. The very quiet parts they've been doing for the past 28 years. This is not new. And I think it took this lockdown period to show people that. And if I must be frank, as a final thought, this lockdown period also saw the greatest amount of growth to my channel, because suddenly the ideas I've been talking about since 19 Futsek in my context, I'm a young man, but the ideas that I used to and still talk about, but back then I was dismissed, especially on campus. There goes that right-winger Big Daddy Liberty character, or Sikle back then, blah, blah, blah. Those same young people come to me now, and they say, Chief, you are right. You are right. The scales have fallen away from my eyes, in the sense that I see the ANC for exactly what it is. I see the EFF for exactly what it is. I won't vote DA. I won't vote Freedom from Plus or blah, blah, blah. There's still that racial tinge, right? That unfortunately the corporate media also sells up, even though it's really not the case. But you're seeing a development in our politics that begins to say, actually, okay, fine, if you're not going to vote for the DA or Freedom Front Plus, maybe there's a Action SA or a whatever else, maybe a Purple Cow movement or whatever. And those parties are seeing traction. And I put it to people, and I've always been saying this, South Africa is on the cusp of change. We just haven't had someone who's brave enough to actually say ideas first, then a leader you can rally around. Ideas first, though. We've always sort of put the cart before the horse. Oh, follow this guy, Mashaba. Follow this guy, my money. Follow this guy, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then they disappoint us when you realize they are of no substance. They're just suits in front of you. So the work I'm doing in conclusion, as a last gasp, is to say, no, focus on the ideas first. And once people are empowered to stand and rally around certain ideas, then they'll start looking around for the politician or the leader who best represents them and those ideas. And if they don't find that politician in the current status quo, by God, I can assure you, they will stand up from their own communities. And this local government election showed you that. Greatest number of independent candidates registered in this election. And I believe that'll be it bodes well for the future, if that'll be the case going forward. But the ideas matter.
Sorry, there is one. Recent legislation. Our president is not going to stop our lockdown until such time as he's brought legislation in which he can actually put into place. I'd like you to comment on that legislation and whether it is constitutional.
Okay, I'll comment in a different way by demonstrating or arguing to you via an example that no one really cares about the lockdown and the state of disaster. It's only the middle class and really the elites who still follow the rules. If I were to take you to my home township, where I stay at the moment, because I'm between my home township and my farm, in the rural area, lockdown has not existed since maybe level 5, the beginning of level 5. In fact, let me be precise and specific, and I tweeted to this effect, because the cops learned first, with a few hot slaps to their faces, not to insist on people wearing masks, or people social distancing, or trying to stop people at the entrance of buildings by putting them. Now again, I'm not making a judgment as to whether that's right or wrong, I'm just describing like the sky is blue, it's just a statement of fact. In most of our townships, I forget who makes this quote of good people break bad laws. I forgot who made that quote, but it's also a classical liberal. And you see it in our township. Good people break bad laws. In my township, no one is going to be told to wear a mask. I mean, they'll still do reasonable things, right? You know, like maybe if they're congregating, there'll be a bit of space, or they'll insist on a ventilated room. So there's still some logic. But when it comes to the state of disaster regulations that are absolutely asinine and they recognize or follow nonsense, no one follows them. So that you have a situation where actually the president can pass as many regulations or new laws as he wants. It's ordinary people who will quickly burst his bubble when he then has to force that same police force that was overwhelmed in July to try and enforce those laws. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing, because I do believe in the rule of law in a society, but law follows what people morally consent to in a society, and most people look at these lockdown regulations and realize what I argued to you earlier on, which is these politicians are now saying the quiet part out loud. So, simple answer, he can pass those laws, good luck trying to enforce them.
Thank you, Sir Claire.
Thank you.
I think there's still some snacks as you head out, and thank you again.